Hi, Niall. Yeah, great to have you as the kind of first guest on Makers Marketing, the kind of deep dives that we're looking to do.
Well, thank you for the invite, Elliot, and it's an honour, I'd say, to be the first. So looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be great.
Yeah, it might be some blips along the way with it being a first go, but let's see how we go.
Let's give it a go.
Um, it'd be great, obviously the idea is that we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into the internal podcast that you run and how that acts as your content engine. It'd be great to get a bit of understanding just in terms of your background and how you came to where you are today.
Yeah, so I'll try and keep it short and concise because it is a little because I could go into a lot of detail, but essentially, so I started off as a doing journalism at university. So I love writing. I wanted to be a journalist, but at the time, the paper industry in the UK wasn't in its best state, let's say, and the digital side hadn't quite took off. So I didn't quite go down that career path. I actually ended up working for the Yellow Pages in the UK. And I used to write websites for like builders and plumbers, for SEO and things like that. So I learned a lot. What I didn't know at the time was that's one part of marketing. So I was doing these websites, and I got an opportunity to join a software company, an ERP software company, where I was unexpectedly thrust into a marketing position. All of a sudden, it ding in my head. I was like, well, this is exactly what I'm looking for career-wise. So since then, I've sort of worked for various different sizes of companies, from like a 10-person startup all the way to where I am today with Siemens. Hundreds of thousands of colleagues around the world. So I've got lots of different varied experiences. And I sort of turned myself on LinkedIn as like an accidental martyr. So I fell into marketing by accident. And then I've been promoted into roles, been given opportunities, I should say, by some very forward-thinking bosses in the past to help me progress. And actually, an important part of this, actually being able to put stuff into place and actually action stuff. Because if you have someone behind you, and that's a key part of this, you have someone behind you, backs you, who says, I believe in you doing this, then that's a really key part of it as well. But I'm really looking forward to going into the detail of it. But then, today, today I work for Siemens. So I'm the head of marketing for Senseye predictive maintenance, which was actually an acquired company about 3.5 years ago now. Actually, June 22. So nearly 3 years ago now. So we're a 50-person startup at that point, now fully part of Siemens. And since then, Senseye, the product, I don't want to go too much because we're not talking product focus, but it's now sort of an umbrella for a number of other sort of related products as well. So this strategy was originally set up for one product. Now it's sort of a suite of products within the Siemens context as well. So that's quite a shift too. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, that's great. And it's interesting you say that you came from a journalism background, because that seems to have then lent itself really well to the skill of podcasting. Can you go into the background for what inspired the launch for the Senseye podcast?
Yeah, and you're right, and that's a really important point. So the skills I picked up doing journalism, and then, I mentioned it, the other pages, but you're right, on the other side, because at some point you think, have I, I did this degree and I'm not using it, but in fact, I'm using it every day now, because the skills I picked up in terms of interview technique and writing the right questions and building a storyline, which you have to. It's not just about chucking random questions; it has to be a proper storyline, and the fundamentals are from journalism. So it sort of come full circle in that respect. But to your question about the podcast, so we originally launched it as Senseye. I think it's probably about 4 years ago now. So it was before the acquisition, so we launched it as Senseye. And I think at that time, I hadn't fully developed it into what it is today, which we'll talk about in terms of generating content. I think at the time it was just, I saw the opportunity for a better outlet for, capturing what I call sort of capturing the knowledge within a business and putting it out into the public. Because at the time, being, again, that background of websites, and I was very focused on blogs. Like, over my career, I've written so many blogs, and I was very content focused, but there was just something I was seeing in B2B marketing where the shift was moving towards podcasts as a medium, and then to get that message across. But then another switch happened. Well, a couple of things happened within Senseye. So first of all, I was promoted into a more senior marketing role. So at the time, VP of marketing, which allowed me the strategic opportunity to put into place this strategy where I could get more juice out of the podcast. So a colleague actually termed it juicing the fruit. And again, we can go into that. But yeah, it led me to think, well, actually, we can take this much further than simply interviewing people for the podcast. We can get so much more value and scale up our content production massively.
And was it difficult to get buy-in from leadership at Senseye to launch that podcast, or was it very kind of was it done on a very low budget initially to try and prove out the value? Was that a difficult process?
So I guess to start with, because I hadn't fully developed this idea of it being the center of our content and demand generation strategy. So at the time, I'd almost limited it in a sense to, it'd be great, because we can create some great episodes and educate the market and things like that. So that's before I got promoted. But when I got promoted, and I wanted to shift our strategy, because what I was seeing, and it's all related, but what I was seeing is a sales team that were, too stretched, chasing lots of different leads, because we're all, with marketers, it's high volumes of leads we needed. But I was seeing that wasn't effective at Senseye, because a salesperson's time, they were focused on not just new leads, but the opportunities. And then when they become customers, so the whole length at the time, that was how, so they were busy. So they didn't have time to chase around for people who didn't want to speak to them. So I had this strategy shift where I thought, well, actually, let's focus their time on the people who actually want to speak to them. So high intent leads, and highly educated leads. But the way to do that is we need high quality content that we can then change into different formats and then distribute in the channels where people where people consume that content on a consistent basis, because the market we're in, predictive maintenance, is very saturated, requires a lot of education. There's a lot of myths and there's a lot of confusion around what predictive maintenance is. So I know it's gone a long way from your question. So the original podcast, it was a bit tricky, because I was pitching it as, oh, this is another useful channel for us to do, as well as blogs and stuff. But then when I got promoted and I had the opportunity to shift the strategy, I was like, well, actually, this is the central point to then repurpose and scale up our content production massively with a smaller team.
Yeah, I've got to say you're a fair bit ahead of the game with that strategy then, because it seems like now LinkedIn is kind of full of information about how the B2B buying journey is, they're 70% of the way there by the time they've actually contacted a sales rep. So I can imagine now it's quite useful having the experience of starting a podcast 4 or 5 years ago as your content engine, because now I imagine it's quite a refined process. Can you talk me through how that podcast fits into the broader content strategy today then?
So you're sort of hinted around the edges of it there, but it really is, as you describe, Elliot, is the central point of the strategy. So, and you mentioned it before the call, but I've joked about this internally as well about it doesn't actually matter if people listen to the podcast. We could have 0 listens and we'd still get huge amount of value, because what we do as a team, we turn that content into, when I mentioned distributing into different channels, we turn it into small clips, for example, and push it out on LinkedIn and paid LinkedIn ads, or we'll turn them into blog posts, which I've got someone on my team who does that. We've created white papers out of them. You could even put the clips together and create online courses internally to teach people about predicting. The possibilities are actually endless. And I think it's a mistake that people make. They look at a podcast and think, oh, I've done it now, and off onto the next thing, or I've done this blog. When you should actually look at each piece and go, can I squeeze as much value out of that as possible? Because most of the time, even if it's a blog post, you can turn it into like social media posts, like different. And I used to do that in previous roles. So it's but being ahead of the game. I know you said being ahead of the game. I mean, it's a very nice thing to say, but I should actually credit who inspired me, and it's a guy called Chris Walker, who runs a company called Refine Labs. It's sort of evolved a lot over the years, but it's like a B2B marketing agency, to give it a very without going into the details. But it was him and listening to his podcast and it was really just common sense marketing that, like, as you alluded to, Elliot, people buy differently now. And we as marketers, B2B marketers, need to adapt to that new journey, how people buy, which is very they do it themselves. They've got the internet, they've got social media, they've got colleagues and communities where they get this information. So they don't necessarily need a salesperson to hold their hand through the process. And so we as marketers need to provide that education and the content they need to be able to make an informed decision, because people don't have lots of time either. So it's about that as well.
Yeah, I think it's also a real benefit now with, we've all seen the amount of fairly bland content repurposing you can do with the help of AI now, that having the ability to have video and a podcast immediately stands out from a lot of other companies' marketing, because you're creating an immediate connection, and it's something that isn't so as repeatable as generating an AI blog post, which is kind of seems to be flooding the internet at the moment. So I do think it's such an effective core to a content strategy, because yes, you can then eventually repurpose that point of view and those insights into written content, but you're starting off from like an expert kind of journalistic led interview to start off with.
And it's like I said, I think I mentioned before, but that is so important that you have the buy-in internally is important, but not just in terms of management and believing in it, but it's actually the experts internally. Because if I was doing a podcast about predictive maintenance, people would switch off after 5 minutes because I only know a certain amount. But my job is to capture the expertise within Siemens, Senseye, but also Siemens as a whole, and importantly external experts as well, and package it up. And that's my job, really, if you think of it like that, and package it up and make it as easy to consume as possible. But I'm very lucky to work with many, many fantastic colleagues, very knowledgeable colleagues who could, and for me, it's also good because it's a learning experience for me. I learn so much. It's not just about the content and how it positions us in the market and how it educates the market, but I also learn so much just by doing these interviews. So it's really a benefit to me as well.
Yeah, I guess that taps into my next question, because sometimes marketers complain because they struggle to get buy-in from those subject matter experts internally, especially speaking to smaller businesses with one-person marketing teams. It doesn't seem a massive priority. What does that process look like in terms of trying to get buy-in from the SMEs, securing their time on a weekly or monthly basis, and I guess selling internally the value of the podcast?
And it's an interesting one. I mean, there is. I'm trying to think, because we're talking about a different sort of selling in terms of, I guess what you're saying is about encouraging people to take part in the podcast and be a part of it. I mean, I don't want to speak for colleagues. I mean, maybe at the start there might have been some, skepticism about, why do we do this? I think there's always a bit of that when you do some new marketing initiatives, like, why? But generally the team at Senseye, so pre-acquisition, and Siemens afterwards have been very much bought in. They understand the market needs a lot of education. That's what I've been positioning the podcast. That's what, it helps us educate a market which is very confused and it's very hard to differentiate. And there's a lot you need in place in your own organisation to be able to be ready for predictive maintenance. So with all that in mind, it was very easy to pitch a podcast where we're saying, well, if you help me, I can help educate the market. So for example, if I'm talking to a colleague implementing these projects, hopefully by the time that what is happening, and I've spoken to colleagues, what should happen is they should get better projects with customers who understand predictive maintenance more. So it's for them to feel the benefit further down the line. If they're seeing better leads come through and better opportunities and better customers, come through, more ready customers and more educated customers, then that's the ultimate proof point. But of course that takes time. It's not like you turn this on and in 3 months' time it does it. You have to do it consistently for 6, 9 months, maybe even a year, which is also an issue when you're obviously justifying stuff internally, which is an interesting dynamic as well.
And when you say for the year, when you are planning out the podcast and the topics, how do you go about selecting those topics? Do you plan it out by quarter, by year? And what do you base that topic selection on?
Yeah, I know as marketers, we're ultimately, we all know about the different stages of funnels and mapping content to funnels and stuff like that. And there is some truth in that, but I guess the honest answer is we're not so rigid in the sense that we go, we haven't got enough content for awareness, so we need more content for awareness, or we need stuff for, the decision stage or that kind of thing. It just somehow naturally happens because I guess the question is also about where do we get our content ideas, and it's really, again, talking to customers, talking to colleagues, listening in LinkedIn and communities like yourselves, and seeing what the key issues are. And then naturally, if you're taking the feedback from the market, from colleagues and people actually interacting with customers, then ultimately you're going to cover all the topics that are important, whatever stage they're in. So that doesn't help you in terms of what we plan. So it's really a lot of the topics come from there. We do a lot of repurposing of other content to, so webinars and things like that are hosted sometimes regionally or centrally. But again, we don't want to waste that content. We want to reuse that as well. And then, of course, there's more product-focused things. So when we have big announcements, like, for example, we've announced in the past year, big stuff around generative AI and Copilot. So we've done, special podcasts, let's say, and special podcast episodes there. So really, it comes from multiple sources. I mean, the actual, the editorial process, or the process of which we may come on to in terms of recording, editing, all that kind of thing, it becomes a selection process. But really, it's a big pool of ideas, and then we as a team decide what do we record, and then we decide later, what should go out and when, kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm glad you've said that, as opposed to giving it some kind of percentage on, we do X% on bottom of funnel. Because I think as marketers, it's tempting because you can easily categorize it in your mind of, okay, yeah, we can map out the buying journey and then do content here and here. And then you tend to neglect actually having consistent conversations with your customers and answering those questions on a consistent basis. And it's a bit of a disconnect then, as opposed to basing that off essentially customer feedback, customer conversations with marketing or with sales reps or even with technical support, because those tastes and needs and education gaps change over time anyway.
And actually, I guess to extend that point as well, so I guess the other point is buying journeys, to the point that buying journeys have changed significantly in the last 10, 15 years, is they're not linear anymore. They don't go through a funnel like, they're at this stage, and then you send an email and they'll move to this stage, and then they see a social media post and they move to this. It's almost like this. It's like zigzagging everywhere, going round in a circle, then disappearing for 6 months, and then they'll come back in. But for us personally as well, Senseye, what I was talking about then is the point up to being a lead and then become known to us. But the actual buying journey, which can last 6 to 9 months, is exactly that as well. They'll drop in, they'll drop out. And so the education piece isn't just up until they become a lead and market it. And we don't just go, well, that's us done. We're educating all the way through the process, till they become a customer. And then hopefully when they scale and expand and renew in the future, it's a constant education process. And so to that degree, I guess we do think of content that goes beyond, we don't place it in these buckets, but we are thinking about content that will, encourage customers to think about expansion and things like that. So we do cover those topics too. But yeah, that is a significant part of it, that the buying journey has changed, and that's the core part of it. And the other thing you said, Elliot, about customer interviews, equally very, very important. Not enough marketers talk to customers. No, I've said this on other podcasts and things I've been on, but it's a real shame, because I think a lot of the time there's a presumption that, it's a sales thing, or account managers, it's that they should talk to customers. But how are we supposed to market to people if we don't talk to them and try and understand why they buy and how they buy? And I've done that with prospects, with customers, and you start to see patterns of, not every journey is the same. You start to see certain patterns of how they approach technology buying. So please, if you're listening to this as a marketer, talk to your customers. That's my number one bit of advice from this episode.
Yeah, completely agree. And also, I think I was speaking to someone who's in-house marketer just earlier this week, and they were fairly junior and were finding it difficult to get buy-in from the sales team to go and speak to the customers. But you've now got the benefit of a lot of these meetings via Zoom or whatever else you're using being transcribed. A lot of these sales meetings are now being automatically transcribed. So as a marketer, all you need to do is just get access to those sales meeting transcriptions. And that is not directly speaking to your customer, but all these different data points that are now being collected do give you something to work on, even as a junior marketer that might not have the kind of sway to immediately go and start speaking to very senior customers.
Yeah, no, you're right. Because again, I appreciate that it's not always easy to talk directly to customers. And actually, us as Senseye, before we used a tool. I mean, whether we're promoting tools, but we used a tool called Gong, which is quite well known in the market, which records tools and summarizes them, and even provides feedback to sales on, how they, do they say Senseye too much in a sales conversation or whatever it might be. But that was a real invaluable tool for me as a marketer, because I could just, if I saw a lead come through the website, I could then sit in the background of the call or watch the recording afterwards and actually understand exactly, because they would ask those same questions, like, how did you hear about us? What's your situation? And yeah, so you're 100% right. If you couldn't, even that's a fantastic step. But again, I'm not sure enough marketers do that. Yeah. And I still think it's a big shame, really.
Yeah, no, completely agree. So I guess, that's a great way of deciding on the topic selection then. In terms of the kind of more nitty-gritty stuff of actually producing the podcast, can you walk me through the kind of recording, editing, publishing phase of that? Because it's a weekly basis podcast, right, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. Well, we publish twice a week now.
Okay.
And we actually have so much content. I was joking yesterday with the team about doing 3 times a week, because we're almost overflowing with content, which is a very good position to be in, because my nightmare is actually running out of content. But the process was very simple, and I can take it back right to the beginning, where at the time it was just 3 of us on the team. So it was me recording the podcast. We had my video editor editing the podcast, and then another person on my team doing the distribution, which essentially is social media and paid social ads. And that's really, I mean, you can outsource some of them if you're a one-man band and that kind of thing. There's loads of agencies out there who will, edit your podcasts and that kind of thing. But we did it as a 3-person team. And then it really, from my point of view, and we had that consistently going, you got that flow going. And then it really sort of took off when we next added a copywriter to the team, or content lead. And she would, like I said, turn them into blog posts, turn them into social media posts, and it allowed us to scale the distribution aspect. And then another person joined the team, and then she started to record podcasts. She's a very good host, comes across really well. And so there's 3 of us on the team who record podcasts. And so we've got this flow of constant ideas, constant recording. And so we've got a big backlog. But in terms of what we do now we've got the flow going. We've been doing it 3 or 4 years with some changes and iterations along the way. But we basically sit down, we have a marketing meeting once a week, and we carve out about 20 minutes of that, what we call like editorial. So back to the journalism thing, where you all sit in a room and go, which story should we focus on today? And that's essentially what we do. We look at what's been recorded, ready to go. What should we publish this week? What's maybe waiting to be approved, because it has to go through some sort of approval process. We can talk to the editor about what you're editing this week, what's coming up. And then as a team, we can say, okay, so what are you recording this week? Is there any things coming up? Or I might have some ideas about, I think we should record something about this. Who wants to do that? And that kind of thing. So it really comes down to, once you've got it up and running and really producing on a consistent basis, it becomes like an editorial meeting, and that's how it should be, where you're sort of looking, going, what should we post this week? What's most important this week to cover? And it could be based on a wide range of criteria. It could be a new product release, could be a big announcement, whatever it may be. But the critical thing to get to that point is posting consistently. But I'm sure we'll talk about that. But yeah, that's the basic process. Turn it into like an editorial meeting on a weekly basis is my advice.
And were there kind of any unexpected challenges or lessons learned along the way on how you approach the podcast on that kind of weekly basis?
Well, so many. I mean, that's part of the thing you got to let go of yourself, is the first podcast, not even the first podcast, the first 10 podcasts you do, and this is just about recording, is not going to be very good. I'm not going to say about yours, because this is the first one, isn't it, Elliot? Sorry. Yeah. So this one might be good. Hopefully it'll be good. But but maybe don't go in the expectations in your mind that it's going to be the greatest podcast of all time. Because I remember my first podcast I did, it was actually with external guests, and I was, nervous, and I was looking at the questions and trying to think of too many things. But all that was the main challenge for me, is getting over that hurdle where it becomes natural. And obviously the only way it becomes natural is by doing it over and over again, making mistakes, stumbling over a question a few times and that kind of thing. I think what we also learn, and yet this is also what you learn by doing as well, is because we started off with Zoom and sort of a basic setup, and we've sort of slowly grown or improved the equipment we use, the software we use. We use studios now as well from time to time for special episodes. And we've developed a lot of things. You can even go into the very detail about the intros and stuff. It's like, how do we improve the intros, and you could go into that really minute detail of it. There's so much I could cover, but the key to it is don't get stuck in planning stuff. Every minor detail, and I need to plan everything before I can launch, and then iterate earlier. And over 4 years, could do a whole podcast about how we've iterated the podcast over the years, because from where it was day one to now is like chalk and cheese, both in terms of how we record, the presenters and the guests we choose, and that sort of process. Everything's changed, but you can only learn that by doing.
I guess just a question on the back of that then is where is that feedback loop? Is that coming off a hunch from the marketing team when you're listening back to episodes? Is it coming from elsewhere in the team or externally from customers? How do you learn how to iterate on certain aspects?
Yeah, it's really a completely mixed. It's a really good question, actually. It's a mixed bag. So of course, we've got direct colleagues in the Senseye team. We've got people in the broader Siemens team. There's a lot of people internally listening to podcasts. So if you're working for a massive organization, and I think you might have said internal podcast at the end, so it is an external podcast or designed to be external. But if you work for a huge company, the benefit of it is it could also be an internal podcast. So we're actually educating people internally about our product and the predictive maintenance market. So it's a big, big benefit for both sides. So it's a lot of colleagues' feedback. We do get customer feedback as well. I've spoken to customers who said they listened to the podcast, and that's always really great to hear, because obviously we're trying to sort of educate people, keep that topic top of mind. I get feedback through sales colleagues about even prospects saying, "Oh yeah, I listened to in the first meeting. Oh, I listened to your podcast. It was really good about this episode about whatever it might be." So it's really multiple sources, and obviously we self-critique as well, which is difficult because we don't like listening to our own voices and that kind of thing. But and I guess one other tip as well is a bit off the wall, but we use Gartner, a bit like global analyst firm, and normally that's associated with industry topics and trying to talk to industry analysts. But they've actually got a great sort of mark. I'm not an advert for Gartner either, not selling Gartner services, but we include them in the feedback loop because they're talking to other people who do podcasts and other experts, so marketing experts who will listen to the podcast and then break it down bit by bit. Oh, your intro could be improved. It was a bit long, or all this kind of. Or you're not interrupting. Can't remember the word, but when someone talks too long, you're supposed to sort of step in, like I'm doing now. but so it's multiple sources. There's no one answer, but any feedback you can get from any source is always going to be invaluable. And the key to it really is taking it on board, because it's easy to be like, "Oh, cheers," and then do nothing. But yeah, and that doesn't mean you have to accept every bit of feedback and every opinion, but certainly consider it and consider implementing it, because I don't know everything about podcasts. I've done a lot of them, but all new ideas should be encouraged, really.
Yeah, and I guess going back to what you said, and when you've spoken to prospects before that have said that they've listened to your content, that is, I guess at that point, it's a marketer's dream. But it's going back to what you said about the podcast being that core part, which is then repurposed. In a lot of ways, the prospects, even if they're reading a blog post or reading something looking at something on social media on the LinkedIn or seeing a LinkedIn ad, they are in a way almost listening to the podcast without realizing it, because it's all coming from that, that basis.
And actually, I've got a little story to tell I'll try to keep it brief, but I spoke to a customer it's probably a year or two ago, about their buying journey and how they buy things. And it was really interesting. So one of the things he mentioned to me is that because he approached Senseye, it was Senseye at the time, so before the acquisition. So he approached Senseye and they weren't quite ready to proceed that time. So they sort of went away, which happens as part of our sales process quite a lot, not quite ready to proceed. But then what happened is our LinkedIn ads, so these ads that kept popping up with our video clips and stuff kept popping up, and he'd be like, oh, that's really interesting. And so eventually it'd be like, I'm going to go onto YouTube and watch the full length, because we'd put the full length video on YouTube. So he'd go to YouTube, watch the video. And most interestingly of all, he wasn't actually our target sort of buyer persona necessarily. So he was like, but actually this will be more of interest to the colleagues. He sent it on to 2 or 3 other colleagues who are actually our buying persona. So there's also a myth or a focus so much on B2B and has to be for this content, for this buying persona, but doesn't always have to be, It doesn't always have to be. You have to catch the eye of someone it could be an intern who sees it, but then they share it internally in their organization, then it gets picked up that way. And so through, to your point, Elliot, it wasn't actually directly the podcast, but it was actually the original medium was podcast, but it was actually the clips on social media and then the full YouTube video, which actually drew them back into Senseye. Now they're a customer, being a customer for 2 or 3 years now. So those proof points are really what get me very excited and and happy. And I can share. And then the important thing is you share them internally as well. You talk to customers and you go, look, this is what they're saying. I'm not saying podcasts are great and content's the way forward. It's customers that are telling me this. So it's very important when you do these interviews and stuff is to share the findings internally, because that's how you educate internally as well.
Yeah, it's a really effective story, really, because like I said, you don't often hear that from customers. You know that the buying journey is messy, but to actually get a breakdown of exactly what their buying journey is so interesting. And like you've just alluded to, like that's such an important step to be able to go back to the team, the marketing team as well, to so they know that they're doing a good job, but also the wider team within the company, so they buy into this and they can understand exactly why content and educating the market is so important.
Yeah, and it's an important discussion point, because you think about every year, every marketing leader who is responsible for a budget and a strategy, every year you basically have to justify. Yeah, you have to justify, why you're doing something. So the more insight, you could show podcast listens and downloads. And actually, how you measure stuff like podcasts is actually almost a different episode in itself. But if you can show that customers are saying, there's no argument about it. I'm not making a presumption. I'm just listening to customers and then creating a strategy and a budget that supports that. And it gives you just so much more credibility, and people start to really believe in what you're saying, because you're just every company is customer focused. So the more you can push their point of view, that's only going to be for the better.
Yeah. Great. Well, I've really appreciated the time you've given to break this down. I guess my last question would just be other marketers within the Makers marketing community who are considering launching a podcast. And sorry, I said earlier internal podcast. I mean like a podcast produced in-house rather.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Perfect.
What advice, you've given some great advice already, but what advice would you give based on your experience of doing it over the last 4 years?
Yeah, so I think I'm just try and break it down a little bit. So I would certainly, one thing is to get started. So don't sit too much in planning mode. I'm going to plan out all of my episodes for the next 6 months, and I'm going to, work out exactly, what equipment I'm going to have. All you need to get started is, I've got a very basic setup even now. It's just like a mic, and I can't remember what this thing is, but keeps the sound quality high by all accounts, and the headphones. All you need is Zoom or some sort of video recording software. And if you don't have the in-house resources, then there's resources out there to edit the podcast. So you've got the tools already in place to get started. So don't think about overproduction. It's got to look amazing. You've just got to get started and start learning very early. I'd also and maybe haven't covered it in too much detail, but don't see the podcast as like an isolated thing. So use it as a way to capture the expertise within your business, but then think about, what can I do with this video or this audio? Turn it into mini clips and turn it into social media posts, turn it into blog posts, and put it in the channels and the places where your particular customers consume that content, because that's the way you're going to reach them. And then I guess finally is be consistent and continue to do it. And because it's very easy to do a couple of podcast episodes, something else distracts you, and then it's like, oh, well, it's been a while now, so we'll just stop it. You need to keep doing it consistently for quite a while. And sometimes for it, like anything, it's like you need to keep doing it for it to become a habit. And so it's being consistent. So it's getting started. It's doing it consistently. And then it's thinking about how you can reuse that content to get the maximum return on investment and the maximum use out of that content, because that will allow you to scale your efforts as well at a later stage.
Brilliant. I think that's really good advice. And like you said as well, if you're basing that back to speaking to the customer and consistently and using as a way of content or topic selection as well, if you couple those two pieces of advice up, I think you've got a really good starting point there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Niall, I really appreciate you being the guinea pig, really, and coming on the first kind of Makers Marketing Mastermind. I will share this with the community, and I'm sure they'll get just as much value from it as I have.
No, and thank you for inviting me to be the first contributor. I mean, if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out to me directly, I'm on LinkedIn and all that kind of thing. So just feel free to connect and reach out. I'm happy to even have a chat. If you want to chat through some ideas, just let me know.
Great. Appreciate that, Niall. Cheers.
Thank you.